this pandemic has revealed serious problems with governance, fragile health and economic systems, and so on. We are still in the midst of it, but it seems that the pandemic will have significant impact on the way societies function for many years to come, and it may increase the risk of outbreaks of violence and conflict. The Institute for Economics and Peace report suggests that some early forecasts are showing that pandemic has caused an unparalleled humanitarian and economic crisis that we haven't seen in many, many decades. So in many places, there has been an increase in violence and tension related to job losses, food poverty, access to health, and other grievances. And this tension has been mirrored in online spaces where the incidence of digital harm has exploded. So the panel will explore these dynamics and where they will lead world's peace, and also reflect on what can be done to respond to these threats. So what we will do is to start off with a presentation from our panelists, and I will then take questions from the audience. And then we will have a second round of interventions from the panel, in which I will ask the panelists to reflect on possible responses, solutions to some of the issues around social unrest related to pandemic. And after that, we will have a second round of questions and answers. Now, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our three panelists, and I'll do it in the order they will be speaking. Mr. Serge Stroobants is Director of Europe and MENA region of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Ms. Sasha Havlicek is CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And my colleague, Dr. Mary Martin, is Director of Business and Human Security Program at LSE. Let me now turn to our first speaker, Mr. Serge Stroobants, who will share with us some of the key findings from this year's Global Peace Index. Serge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your introduction, also the opportunity to have this incredible panel gathered together today to discuss the topic at hand. I will share my screen and start the presentation. So the Global Peace Index 2020, as said, is an annual piece of research by the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's the 14th edition, and we rank 163 countries, about 100% of the world population, using 23 different indicators. We developed it ourselves, and it's overseen by and guided by a panel of international experts. The 23 indicators are distributed over 3 domains. We have 6 measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict, 10 measures of societal safety and security, so a clear focus on internal security, and 7 measures of militarization. One of those measures is a positive measure and is looking at the investment made in UN peacekeeping operations. So the key findings for this year's Global Peace Index. For every index we produce, there is an interactive map like this one available on our website, visionofhumanity.org. This gives you at the first glance, the distribution of peace in the world, going from dark green countries, the most peaceful one, to the red countries, the least peaceful one. You can also click on each and every country and access the data, the rankings per indicator, and global data and rankings also. So last year, we experienced a decrease in peacefulness by 0.34%, and this is the 9th deterioration in the past 12 years. The improvements came from a lower terrorism impact, so we had a decrease by minus 75% last year of the terrorism impact, and this is a continuation of the trend over the past 4 to 5 years since the peak of IS, 2014-15, 33,500 deaths by terrorism last year, less than 8,000. We see also a continued decrease in the homicide rate, and we also experienced last year less weapons imports and exports. The deterioration came primarily from the intensity of internal conflict, so clearly also leading to some civil unrest at some point. The number of refugees and IDPs, so we have 18 million plus 10 million in the past year, and we doubled the amount of refugees and IDPs over the past decade. And we also saw degradations on the political terror scale. So there we are looking at extrajudicial killing, imprisonment without trial, use of torture, and political terror to your population. The highlights. So Iceland is still the most peaceful country in the world, followed by New Zealand, and then we see a large group of smaller countries applying liberal democracies as their political systems. The largest improvement were for Azerbaijan and Armenia, still, of course, ranked around the 120th place on the index, but we saw an improvement due to the Nagorno-Karabakh issue that has seen a ceasefire last year. This has an impact on the overall region, Russia and Eurasia, that has the largest improvement last year. We see that Europe is still the most peaceful region of the world. We saw an increase in political instability and a small deterioration of peace, but still the most peaceful region of the world. On the other end of the index, we see that Afghanistan remains the world's least peaceful nation of the world, permanently increased over the past decade. Afghanistan is also the country most impacted by terrorism and #1 on our global terrorism index. We saw the largest deteriorations for Benin and Nicaragua. Benin, like kind of quite violent elections last year, and also the impact of, I would say, Islamist extremism in the Sahel region and the neighboring countries. And also Nicaragua, internal conflict, homicide rate, crime perception. So this is there for the second year in a row. This has, of course, an impact on the regions with the largest deterioration, South America and Central America. These regions have been there for a couple of years now. We clearly see a trend that is being established and a decrease, really a fall into the violence trap for those regions, really with figures comparable to the MENA regions at the beginning of last decade. And the MENA region is still the least peaceful region of the world, although we saw small improvements last year. So if we open this time window to a last decade, up to 12 years, we see that, of course, only three improvements in peace over the last 12 years. So it's a clear conclusion that we had a decrease in peacefulness by 2.5% over the past decade. And what we also see there is that the speed at which you either win in peacefulness or decrease in peacefulness is completely different. Average 2% when you increase your level of peacefulness, average 13% when you decrease your levels of peacefulness. And this leads to this widening gap between the least and the most peaceful countries in the world. Really, this is something we need to be worried about. So now, as said, we produced special research on civil unrest over a period of about 10 years, the past 10 years. And we've seen that the overall figures for civil unrest increased by 244%. If you go into the detail, 282% for riots, more than 800% for general strikes. Last year, 96 countries recorded at least one violent demonstration. And citizens protest really for a wide range of different issues, going from economic hardship, racism and police brutality that have been at the heart of the protests in the past week, corruption, and many more issues. We also see that Europe had the largest number of protests, but also the lowest level of violence used in those protests, only 35%. So clearly European citizens are using their fundamental freedom of speech and also of demonstration to ventilate grievances and frustrations in the street, but mostly non-violent. Those figures are completely different from for other parts of the world. Just to give you an idea, Sub-Saharan Africa, we saw an increase there by 600 to 800%, and almost all demonstrations ending in violence. What we also expect is that the economic recession is going to, at least the effect of this economic recession, is going to increase the grievances and the frustrations, and therefore also the likelihood of demonstrations and riots, with a clear connection between the levels of preparedness before COVID-19, before the lockdown, and before the economic recession, on the levels of violence during the civil unrest and demonstrations that are linked to the impact of the economic recession. Every time we produce an index, we also estimate to determine the economic value of peace, or from a more negative perspective, the economic impact or the economic cost of violence. A very conservative estimation last year, 14.5 trillion, which is about 10.6% of the world GDP, which is about $1,900 per person participating in this webinar. So just imagine what we would be able to do if we would decrease this by 1 or 10%. So 1% of this estimation equals the global annual budget for overseas development aid, and about 10% is the annual global budget for foreign direct investment. So just imagine what we could do if we would decrease by 1 or 10%. This is the distribution of this budget. About 75 to 80% is clearly invested in prevention and containment of violence, with military expenditure at 40%. Internal security, so basically police force, 35. This is topped by private security military companies, about 5.6. Then the direct impact, with the consequences of the use of violence: homicide, almost 8. Suicide, still consider a violent ending of a human life. Conflict, violent crime, and so on. So now, special attention on COVID-19 and peace. The first correlation that we were able to determine is a correlation between the level of air travel and the take-up of COVID-19. So we clearly see a stronger take-up of COVID-19 around those large international hubs, airport hubs, such as Heathrow, London, New York, with 3 major international airports, but also the region of Milan, Spain, with several airports and a high level of tourism. But even in a country like Belgium, with Brussels, kind of a connecting platform in Europe. So a clear correlation there. We expect that most of the indicator of the global peace index, which is looking at negative peace, per definition, the absence of peace, or the absence of violence, or the fear of violence, excuse me, but also the indicators that we use in our positive peace index, we're looking at attitudes, processes, and institutions that you need to create, maintain, and sustain peace. All those indicators are expected to deteriorate over the coming years. There is positive news to that. So a lot of the financial and fiscal assets will be redirected to the economies that need to be propped up, and therefore less budget might be available for military expenditure, in extenso also for proxy wars. So we could see that regional and global powers impacting those internal conflicts and really making them international conflicts, making them more intense and last for longer. Maybe there we will see that less budget might be redirected to those conflicts. We also saw that some forms of crime, like drug dealing and some forms of petty or violent crime, we saw a temporary reduction for those. On the other side, we saw other forms of violence, like domestic violence, where most of the time in lockdown, the victim and the person who assaulted were locked into the same space, into the same area or same house. High level of suicide, and of course, we clearly see also an increased number of impact of mental illness in our societies. We expect US and Europe to see an increase in political instability. I would say maybe non-recognition of the power of the government, so with no less support for the government, and that of course leading to also more instability in the streets and more civil unrest. US and China relations were deteriorating before COVID-19, before the pandemic and before the economic crisis. This is going to be aggravated, accelerated, catalyzed by COVID-19, what's happening at the moment. And this will clearly have an effect, even a larger effect, on the multilateral organization of the world and those organizations representing it, such as WHO, but also the WTO and UN Security Council. Just think about the discussions that have taken place in the past almost 4 months after the call by the UN Secretary General for a global ceasefire. So the negative, so the flip of the coin of those lower budgets, you know, it would also see the end of this trend in larger investments in UN peacekeeping operations. So less money will flow to those peacekeeping operations. That's also very negative. We can see a same negative development towards international development aid. And then, of course, those countries that are still fragile and heavily relying on this development aid will come and face a large increase in fragility and maybe sliding down into some forms of violence. We also expect that countries with low credit ratings, like Brazil, Pakistan, Argentina, or Venezuela, will have more difficulties to borrow money on the international market, and therefore will not be able to really prop their economies and will face a longer impact and maybe a larger impact also of the economic crisis. So that's a study that we made in a separate paper called COVID-19 and Peace, where we clearly looked at the levels of positive peace basically the levels of resilience of your society in many aspects, and systemic approach to peace, and economic preconditions to be favorable. So we looked at 4 indicators: the level of unemployment, the level of structural debt. We also looked at the percentage of taxation within your GDP, and we also looked at the level of dependence on international trade of your economy. Of course, those 4 indicators should be low to create favorable economic preconditions. And so this analysis is ranging from the blue to the red box: blue high on positive peace and favorable preconditions. The impact is there, but will be manageable, contained, and not so heavy on those societies. On the other end, the red box clearly see that low levels of positive peace, less favorable preconditions, larger and longer impact of the COVID-19 crisis, both from the lockdown, but especially from the economic crisis that is going to follow. And what's really worrying there is to see 2 regional players like Brazil and South Africa being impacted in the red box. This is a slide showing you the interest rate responses to former US recessions, which are mostly an indicator for global recessions. And clearly today, the economic recession that we are facing is much larger already than the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. This slide is also showing you that the kind of magic trick that was used in the past by reducing the interest rates by about 5% points will not be applicable to this crisis, because we started at 1.5% interest rate just before the crisis. So definitely the only solution that we are able to apply is to prop the economy with financial assets. A last point for this year's Global Peace Index, this ecological threat register, where we are looking at several factors linked to the effects of climate change and climate hazards, and we mirror this to the levels of peacefulness. So we have seen over the past decades, the 4 decades, that the number of natural disasters quadrupled. So now if you look at those 18 million refugees and IDPs that I spoke about before, about 60% have been generated by natural disasters, about 40% by conflict. So clearly an increase of the natural disasters also has a strong impact on the number of refugees. So we looked at water scarcity, food scarcity. We looked at the effect of rising ocean levels and other climate hazards. This is just an example. The water-related risk by region, and we see that the regions that will be most impacted, or the most impacted today, are the MENA region, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central America and the Caribbean. Also, the 4 least peaceful regions of the world. So what we see today is that about 2.4 billion people are living in an area that is already facing high to very high threats from climate hazards. And about a bit more than 50%, about 1.25 billion, are also living in a country that is in the bottom 40 of the Global Peace Index. So we clearly see there that all those separate indicators, basically strategic factors influencing peace and security, once you mirror this with violence, you can understand that at some point these different indicators that you can identify in an image as separate little storms will just get interconnected and create a superstorm that is really going to have a tragic impact on many levels of security, and also the use of violence in the coming years, coming decades. So this is the end of my presentation. As said, everything is available on visionofhumanity.org, our website. And of course, we are also active on social media. Before I leave the floor, just one last figure. And this is really the figure that impacted me most when I read the Global Peace Index. In the next 30 years, so by 2050, we expect to see an additional 143 million people displaced by the effect of climate change. And this is distributed 86 million in Sub-Saharan Africa, 40 million in South Asia, and 17 million in Central America and the Caribbean. And I leave to the appreciation of the audience the direction in which those people are going to be displaced, and the impact that this will have on those societies, but also on the most peaceful societies that are just neighboring those regions. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the debate and the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serge. It's a very interesting and I would say intriguing and worrisome some statistics that has come out of your research, really showing that we might be heading towards some turbulent times, not least given the pressure on multilateral institutions, which are meant to shoulder the global response to the pandemic, but also the ecological threats. If I may turn now to our second speaker, Ms. Sasha Havlicek, to tell us what is happening in the online space in reaction to various socioeconomic and political challenges triggered by the pandemic. Sasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vesna. Thank you for having me. And if I may just say thank you to Serge for this extremely rich data. What a sobering picture, quite something. Now, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the trends that we're seeing online in relation to the pandemic, drawing on ISD's computational analysis of weaponized hate and disinformation on the internet, with a particular focus on the so-called infodemic that's received quite a lot of media attention these past months. I will talk just as briefly as possible about the nature of what we're seeing and the scale of what we're seeing in terms of this online challenge of manipulation, if you like, and malign influence, in particular as it relates to political and social implications. And then talk a little bit to what the implications of this online mobilization are for the offline world, for the real world, in terms of the harms that we see. I hope in the conversation later we can look a little bit at policy responses, not least in relation to if you like, the ability of the platforms themselves to respond to these challenges, and of our governments to implement the right sorts of policies and regulatory frameworks to deal with them. But just quickly, so the nature and the scale of the challenge. Over the past 6 months, we've seen COVID-19 really become the new information battlefield. And this is playing out very evidently online. Since 2017, our research has evidenced how disinformation, the kind of playbook that we associated of disinformation, that we came to associate most with the Kremlin's electoral interference in 2016, how democratized it became, how it has sort of landed in the hands of a very wide spectrum of actors since, from other hostile states. And of course, we've seen this for a long time with China, Iran, and other countries entering into this space, to transnational and domestic extremist groups, now all the way through to dark marketing companies, sometimes doing seemingly the bidding of states, sometimes doing the bidding of special interest groups on a transnational basis. And we increasingly see political parties themselves use these tactics. The target of these influence operations, we have seen a large focus on their use during elections, electoral interference. But for a long time, what we've seen is investments by this constellation of actors in much longer range, if you like, cultural change investments, looking at wedge issues and the ways in which they can exploit divisive wedge issues, and of course crises. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise then, with COVID representing in many ways the mother of all crises, that this constellation of actors has been extremely active in relation to the exploitation of the fears around this pandemic. And our digital analysis unit has been monitoring this weaponization of the pandemic by this group of actors. And I sum up really sort of 5 key things that we've seen, 5 key trends. The first is that disinformation in some way has come out of the closet. Overt state actor disinformation has been abundant and very visible, whether it's Chinese or Iranian or Russian official sources and public broadcasters putting out disinformation in terms of, for instance, the origin story for the pandemic. And we see the beginnings of mutual amplification of each other's messaging to that extent. So if non-state actors stepped in to use all of the tools, the sort of Kremlin toolkit after 2016, we're now seeing states dipping into that toolkit of extremists in terms of deploying conspiracy theories, for instance, and integrating these into their public propaganda. But the covert stuff is still there. And what we found is really scaled levels of automated and inauthentic accounts promoting COVID-19 disinformation and the related policy agendas of states. And so we've seen thousands of sock puppet accounts, presumed inauthentic accounts being used to promote this kind of disinformation across mainstream platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, including for very explicit political gain. And the tactics are very varied. We've also seen, and I think it's important, it's very difficult with the data that researchers have available to them, which is shrinking in terms of what we have access to on these platforms, to really get at the question of attribution, what is state, what is not state actor driven. But we have seen that letting these larger inauthentic networks that seem domestic in nature, leaving them be, can of course result in other types of problems. We've seen state actors piggyback on these domestic networks in very effective ways. This is long known of Kremlin activity, but we're now seeing much more of that in relation to Chinese disinformation efforts, and a kind of bleed between conspiracy networks and state actor disinformation efforts, which is resulting in the absolutely enormous proliferation of conspiracy. But it's not just state actors. And as I said, in a way, the sort of net winners in the influence space during this COVID period have been outright conspiracy theorists and networks. QAnon, an absolutely sort of mad conspiracy network that came about and sort of rose during the 2016 elections in the US, has seen an absolutely massive upsurge of volumes of engagement with its content online, a kind of mainstream of the conspiracy space, and of course extremists. And we've seen this all along, that there is a kind of dance between state actor and transnational non-state actor and extremist actors in this disinformation space. Across the ideological spectrum, we've seen extreme groups weaponizing the pandemic to increase traffic, to increase engagement with their causes. White supremacist and accelerationist groups have used COVID-19 to claim that democracy is a failure and to call for insurrectional violence, sometimes very effectively, we've seen. We've seen a spike in discussions around something called the boogaloo, which is a term used by the far right for their sort of impeding second civil war. And it's aimed again at mobilizing citizens towards armed insurrection and targeted attacks. I mean, very clear white supremacist targeted attacks on health workers, ethnic minorities, on calls to infect politicians and journalists and frontline health providers. So direct threats really on the rise. On the Islamist side, we've seen a spectrum of activity with networks of hijacked and hacked accounts repurposed around COVID topics on Facebook, on Twitter, and so on, spreading ISIS, pro-ISIS messaging again. So there's the full spectrum of these bad actors. I think, again, important to remember that more broadly, false and misleading content around COVID-19, despite the efforts of the social media companies and their commitments to ensuring that this would not happen, it is still widely circulated. We have evidence, and despite it being flagged, for instance, by experts, the type of content that the companies have encouraged fact checkers to debunk is still absolutely available in abundance. And that kind of content we found has been shared millions of times across these social media platforms without labels or warnings. An investigation that ISD did with the BBC saw that a set of websites very clearly spreading disinformation around COVID had received over 82 million engagements just on Facebook. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that, that's 6 times the combined engagement of the CDC's and WHO's official pages. So this stuff is reaching enormous amounts of people, engaging with enormous amounts of people. But what does it all matter? I mean, people will often say this is online, we're overreacting to the online, does it really have an impact? And actually, in relation to harms to date, around terrorist content and hate speech content, there's been quite a lot of pushback in terms of people's assumptions that this has a direct impact on offline harm. COVID, I think, has changed that. I think we are and I think that the companies themselves have seen that it is sort of useless to push back on this concept, because we've so evidently seen the impact of this disinformation, this infodemic in the real world. So apart from the very obvious disasters of people drinking bleach and so on, the levels of buy-in to conspiracy theories that I've talked about are just enormous. An Oxford University study has just shown that 40% of people in the UK, I believe to some extent that the spread of the virus is a deliberate attempt by powerful people to gain control. Some 20% believe that the virus is a hoax. So the undermining of faith, just even in scientific fact, is quite enormous. But more than that, on a social and political level, we've seen countries across the globe really experience spikes in anti-Asian, in anti-Semitic, and in other targeted hate incidences. And we've seen, just in relation to 5G conspiracy theories, violent attacks against telecom infrastructure and related personnel in the UK, in Ireland, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. In Missouri, in the US, a man was killed by the FBI plotting to attack a hospital with COVID patients, again, part of a kind of far-right mobilization to violence online. And we've seen these conspiracy theories sparking protests, civil unrest in many places. I mean, US, Australia, Germany, the UK, just to cite a few. So overall, we're seeing a very clear impact on the ground. But bigger than that, and I think that I'll sort of end with this, is what we're seeing writ large across this challenge of the intersection of weaponized hate, if you like, and disinformation. The intersection of narratives, whether it's extremist or state narratives, is an interesting thing to see. And it essentially coalesces around sowing mistrust in democratic government. It so sort of delegitimizes the concept of liberal democracy and its ability to cope with crises. It's fundamentally anti-internationalist, anti-globalization. It's pro-nationalist in its approaches. So these various constituencies are all mobilizing to some extent under the same meta-narrative umbrella. It's pro-authoritarian, it's anti-minority in its emphasis. And as we've said before, this constellation of bad actors, state and non-state, are investing in long-range manipulation efforts in order to shift public discourse and attitudes and behavior around all of the key international agenda items of our time, including migration, climate, the rights space. We see this disinformation become coordinated and executed at scale. Overall, we're seeing the undermining of liberal democratic civic culture and an attack on its institutions at scale. This is what we've called the mainstreaming of extremism, and it's something that we must be absolutely alive to. We performed an audit, if you like, of the platform's response to these types of crises, to their engagements not only around elections, but also around crises like COVID. And it is very clear that despite many of the efforts that they have taken, and there have been efforts, there is a systemic problem in addressing these threats. And I hope we can come in the second part of this discussion to thinking through what types of policies and responses are needed. We've certainly been thinking a lot about that. And we need to get to this quickly. COVID-19, the infodemic, of course, is not the last crisis to be exploited. And as Serge has said, the economic and political backdrop, the geopolitical backdrop that we find ourselves in will mean that we are living in uncertain and polarized times. We will desperately need concerted cross-border responses to this that include addressing the transparency and oversight needed of our information ecosystem.
Thank you very much, Sasha. That was really rich and comprehensive, and absolutely echoes what Serge says is happening in the real world, and it's quite unsettling to hear what this infodemics is doing to peace and stability. And if I may turn to our third panelist, Dr. Mary Martin. Mary, as we weather the pandemic, how do you see this rising social unrest impacting on human security outcomes?
Thank you, Vesna. Yes, so I'm, I suppose, the third leg in this three-legged stool. What I want to do is to say a couple of things, why I think COVID is a crisis of human security and why human security gives us a useful lens for understanding some of the consequences of the pandemic, and indeed elaborating on some of the trends that Serge has identified in the Global Peace Index. And I think it's perhaps useful to move from a discussion of global trends in terms of statistics and Sasha's focus also on the dualism of online threats and how those translate into offline harms. And then look at human security, because all of them offer a slightly different window on peace and social stability, and it's useful to examine them together to build a more layered picture of what is happening. And then the second thing I want to do is try and suggest how human security, in fact, can help us connect those three features of the present world situation: the need to build peace, particularly in fragile countries, the civil uprisings we're witnessing at the moment, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course the COVID pandemic itself. Just to summarize, firstly, what I mean, what we might understand by what human security is, it's people-centered. It's about people. It turns the optic on security from nation states and the global order to look at security in terms of how ordinary people live. And you can think of those threats in three kinds of ways, often called freedom from fear, so physical threats, and obviously that includes health. Freedom from want, so people's material needs for jobs, clean water, food, shelter, and a clean environment. And the third element is dignity, that people need psychological and emotional support, and here we can think of threats such as discrimination on grounds of gender or race, marginalization and inclusion, and the importance of cultural symbols, including religion, to people's well-being. I think I've got a siren going off, excuse me a minute. Human security is also a capabilities approach. So what it does is seek to identify ways that help people realize their potential to be and to do what they aspire to. So it's different, although obviously very closely related to human rights as a universal entitlement, or even humanitarian assistance, which is emergency aid response. So when we talk about human security, we're thinking about enabling and empowering people to determine their own futures and to lead tolerable lives in the face of the threats they face. What does it tell us about the COVID crisis? Well, one of the most accurate and actually long-standing measures of this individual people-centered perspective is the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index. It's been going since about 1990, and it measures a combination of living standards, health, education, in terms of individual prospects. So it was a conscious effort to move away from GDP, macroeconomic type statistics and measurements to focus on individuals at the community level particularly. And for the first time since that index started 30 years ago, the UNDP is saying there's going to be a decline in the Human Development Index this year. So per capita income is expected to fall 4% in 2020, and unemployment is expected to rise, probably pushing between 40 and 60 million people into extreme poverty. And then another thing that the index looks at, education in terms of school closures. UNDP estimates that the effective out of school rate suggests that 60% of children are not getting an education, and leading us to global levels that we haven't seen of undereducation since the 1980s. And then there are other significant effects that on human security that you can see through this lens, which would include particular impacts, for example, on gender equality, the particular negative impacts on women and girls, whether it's on their prospects to be economically sufficient, greater job insecurity, on their reproductive health, unpaid care work, and also gender-based violence. But I think perhaps the most interesting thing that the current forecasts show, and was already evident in earlier reports on the Human Development Index, is that COVID-19 is a magnifying glass, if you like, for inequalities. And this is where I think you can link the idea of human security to the issue of civil unrest. In the last year, 2019 Human Development Report, the highlight, one of their highlights was the fact that demonstrations were sweeping across the world, very much mirroring what Serge has told us in the Global Peace Index. And that had already signaled something that we probably all instinctively know, but you start to see it in statistics, a crisis of inequality. But I think what's interesting is that this inequality has a particularly new character. So while the gap in basic living conditions is actually narrowing for millions of people, the kind of necessities that people want and need in order to thrive, they've changed. And so you're seeing a new generation of inequalities opening up around education, for example, around technology, and also the issue of climate change. And so what the 2019 report came to the conclusion was it's triggering a new great divergence in society of a kind not seen since the Industrial Revolution of the 18th, early 19th century. So you can start to see, obviously, in statistical detail and in this kind of laser attention to certain key human issues, that civil unrest coming on top of the health pandemic, both revealing some of the fault lines in societies, the aggravation of disadvantage, particularly suffered by people on the margins, already displaced people. Serge had mentioned there's a huge forecast of increase in displaced people, minorities, including women. And all that puts the plight of people rather than states, which is how we normally look at the idea of security, puts that in full view. And then finally, I would just say that there's another way in which human security is useful to think about the present crisis and where the impact will come on human security, is that uncertainty factor, which I think is part of that third, if you like, definition pillar of human security, the dignity pillar. Because if people feel nervous, if they feel uncertain, if they feel sidelined from decisions being made in response to the crisis, then you're undermining their agency, their dignity, their sense of emotional, psychological well-being. And if you ignore that factor, that third, sometimes people call it a rather sort of fluffy dimension, because it's quite hard often to capture other than with perception surveys, and there's a lot of controversy around how accurate they might be. But if you ignore that factor, firstly, you undermine the effectiveness of government policy, and we might come back to the policy responses, but the whole impact of central messaging about the crisis, and that's obviously where Sasha's infodemic dilemma comes in. And as the future accelerates, as some observers put it, and current economic models in particular are reimagined and transformed, but not quite getting there yet. Traditional businesses fail, new sectors are emerging, but we're in this period of flux and transition. People's feelings of powerlessness are already being magnified. And so the urge to find solutions on the streets, through anger and in online hate, as Sasha has demonstrated much more fully empirically, then I think that magnifies. So I will leave it there, and then look forward to coming back to sort of drilling down deeper into some of these points, perhaps in the questions.
Thank you very much, Mary. We will now move to question and answers session. I open the floor to the reactions from the audience. Please submit your question to the Q&A function, and keep sending your questions as the discussion continues. So let's see what we've got in our first, what is our first question. Robert Kaplan has a question for all speakers. Will the European political instability after COVID-19 change Europe's position from being the most peaceful region of the world in the foreseeable future, especially with the new reality of social diversion, internet populism, social shifts, and a huge displacement due to climate change in the near future? And Robert is from the Institute for Economics and Peace. Who would like to have a go at this question?
I'm happy to stab at it, Vesna, if I may.
Okay.
I do think that we've been rather complacent about the acquis of liberal democracy and the acquis of the European Union, perhaps the single greatest postmodern project of collaborative governance. And we are going to see challenges from a number of directions to the model that for some time, I mean for decades, really, I think was the model that we thought the world was trying to converge with. That liberal democratic model of governance, that welfare state model of governance. That threat is coming both from within and from without. And I think it's extremely important that we get a handle on the rise of nationalism and populism that has in many ways been, I think, the result of this phenomenon of mainstreamed extremism, resulting in part from the perfect storm of a shift in global wealth from west to east, perhaps. The highest spikes in migration to date, from south to north, from east to west, and the highest spikes in terrorism over this past decade. And with that, we've seen the revolution of our information ecosystem, the massive proliferation of polarization in that information ecosystem, and a marked shift in public discourse towards the extremes. And we have seen a resulting rise of populist and extreme parties at the ballot box, genuinely challenging, I think, the model of liberal democracy from within. And sometimes in more overt and sometimes in more insidious ways. We need to be very clear that this is going to be the challenge for our generation. The impact of climate migration is going to be absolutely seismic. And I don't think that we are in any way ready institutionally, socially, or indeed from the perspective of managing the information fallout and exploitation of that crisis yet to deal with this. We are going to need to get extremely well prepared and resilient if we are to mitigate the worst. So I do think that we're going to see Europe challenged in terms of the acquis of peace that we've grown up with and been, I think, quite complacent about. And we are going to need swiftly, which of course is not what the EU does best, swiftly to find strategic responses to that. I think one of the areas in which we can really have an impact is in, to some extent, I suppose, reeling in the wild west of that information ecosystem. The oversight and regulation, having transparent standards and oversight of that information ecosystem, so platform governance, is going to be an extremely important part of how we get a handle on at least the exploitation of these real grievances and threats.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Mary, would you like to have a go?
A couple of thoughts, really. I think what we've seen of the pandemic so far is, and Vesna said at the outset, we all know it's not just a health crisis, but wherever in the world you look, the state, and it has been largely a state response, the effectiveness of that state response has been determined by not by the health situation so much as how governments have responded. It's a governance crisis. And I remember talking to somebody from the World Health Organization a few weeks ago about the situation in Latin America in particular. And I expected him to blind me with science, you know, about the virus. And all he talked about was governance aspects. So how does that relate to, that observation relate to Europe? Well, clearly at the moment, Europe is European Union is in a state of weak governance. I mean, Sasha mentioned, you know, the inability to respond quickly, but I think with such varying degrees of intervention, non-intervention. So I think my first concern would be that, you know, this is coming on top of such a weak moment for collective governance. And if there is one region in the world that ought to be able to mount a kind of collective cross-border response, it should be the European Union. And clearly, you know, we haven't really even seen that. The other observation I just wanted to make from where I stand, you know, on my kind of human security kind of position, is that I've worked on human security along with Vesna for about 15, 16 years, and it was always thought of as something out there for other people. It was for developing countries or countries that were already in conflict and crisis. And I think what, you know, we've come to understand very rapidly, and I was fascinated by one of Serge's slides to this effect, that, you know, if you look at the different people, the countries and the different sort of red or blue boxes, it was absolutely not how you would have categorized it or thought to categorize it previously. So the fragility, the stability is everywhere. So the human security crisis is not just somebody else's problem. It's definitely a problem for everyone, including in Europe. So I think more than at any time, say in the last 25 years, human security, which, you know, we should get used to thinking as applying to us and how we respond in policy terms.
Thank you, Mary. Serge, do you have any reflections on this particular question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I will definitely concur with what two speakers have said, and this is a key of peace. I mean, this is reflected also in our indexes. We find back all the European countries in the top 60, 65, so really the first third of the index. And really, when you look at region Europe, we will find the EU countries followed by the European non-EU countries, followed by the outbound data of this group, and this would be Turkey considered in the European group. So clearly the effects of this multilateral world that we have had in the past 75 years has created peace and has created economic development. And therefore, when we look at the global peace index, but especially when we look at the positive peace index, we also find all the European countries on the top, back on the top of this index, really building up resilience in the past and still today when it comes to levels of peace. So of course, everything that is happening today is going to happen in the future will have an impact on Europe, but not only on Europe, globally. So we will continue to see an overall decrease in the levels of peacefulness, but we also see that the levels of resilience is the highest in Europe on the positive peace index. So not really sure that Europe is going to really decrease in peacefulness in the coming years to the same extent that we have seen other regions do. So I would say that the preconditions are more favorable for Europe because of the investment that has been made in peace. What we also clearly see is that, you know, I spoke about this inequality or the widening gap between the most and the least peaceful countries in the world. There we did a special analysis and we looked at the impact of the type of political regime in a country. And we have seen that authoritarian regimes, and we spoke about this, Sasha, are really those regimes decreasing the fastest the levels of peacefulness. So, and then of course we have the hybrid regimes, the kind of illiberal democracies, and then we end up with full democracies, decreasing the slowest pace in the levels of peacefulness when impacted. So that's also very important. What I think, if I would think about this question more from as a security expert, I would say what is really worrying me, and this is in line with what Sasha said, is and also what Maria said, is, you know, we're moving away from a multilateral world, so away from this liberal system in international relations where peace is at the heart of the system to allow this economic interdependence or interconnection. And we are shifting more towards a more realist or neo-realist approach to international relations, where peace is not at the center of the system anymore, and where you know, power maximization is there, and the use of force or the use of military is an accepted tool to achieve this power maximization. And so I think this is something we need to be very, very careful for, to see this change in attitude, the change of paradigm in international relations. And there, as Maria said, I don't think that, you know, I still consider Europe, and especially the EU, as this last fortress of liberal approaches to international relations, of multilateralism. And I'm not really sure that as a region or as one of the powers in the world are ready to shift, to let loose the liberal system and to shift again to a more concurrential realist system. And I guess this might be the region that might have the most difficulties to really shift towards another paradigm in international relations.
Thank you very much, Serge. I'm going to take a question from Jane Baker, who will be joining LSE as a student this September. And Jane asks, where should governments be investing to address societal unrest at this time? And just to give you a little bit of time to think, I will bring in a question from Daniel Davis. It's a little bit longish question. Daniel is from Institute for Economics and Peace, that he's asking this question in his personal capacity. And the question for all speakers is, I'd be curious to hear how the speakers think Institute for Economics and Peace could more effectively account for effects outside of countries in light of the expectation that climate change will exacerbate conflicts worldwide. It already does so to some extent. Deaths from external conflicts is a Global Peace Index indicators, as is UN peacekeeping funding. But how could IEP account for countries' emissions, historic and continued? Failing to do so seems to be a failure to attribute responsibility for conflicts and to fail to account for violence coming out of one country but felt in another. So you've got two questions, so please choose what would you like to address. And who would like to go first? Okay, Serge.
I guess one was directly to me and the other one basically also. I would say, for the first question, making sure, like civil unrest, I mean, I gave a large palette of different potential grievances and frustrations that could lead people to move into the streets and ventilate those grievances. I think the concept of positive peace, the systemic approach to peace and development of peace that the IEP has developed over the years is really the answer to this question. One of the key elements of this investment is, of course, to create a more resilient society and, get the economic, social, and ecological and also governance benefits of a more peaceful situation. But when you look at, basically, you need to look at breaking a vicious circle and transforming it in a virtuous circle. When we see low levels of positive peace, we see high levels of grievances and frustration. Most of the time, this degenerates in violence, and then those societies need to invest in more violence to counter that violence, and therefore can invest less into positive peace. And therefore, you have the vicious circle. So what we need to do is make sure that the levels of grievances and frustration is low enough to find non-violent solutions to them through mediation and through discussion. Therefore, these societies do not need to invest in violence to counter those frustrations and grievances, and can invest more in positive peace. So that's what we ideally would need to achieve, is to really break this vicious circle of violence, and therefore invest in the pillars of positive peace. Now, when it comes to the second question, and really focusing on the climate change effects, so the 5th chapter of this year's Global Peace Index is called the Ecological Threat Register. This is going to transform into another pillar of research at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And it's going to be a standalone index and standalone publication. And we aim to also provide an annual review of this index. And clearly there we are going to match and to also compare the impact of climate change on from different ways on the levels of peacefulness. Anyhow, we are measuring the levels of violence throughout the world. And just to give an example on this, the ecological impact, what we have seen also, and this is also part of the research, is that over the past decades, the less and less water disputes, for example, are settled in a non-violent way. And this is really decreasing fastly. So clearly we are facing depletion of some of the resources. We saw that those disputes in the past, about a decade ago, were much more peaceful and really through mediation. And we see that there again, more and more violence will be used in those type of emerging disputes. So it may not be seen as an indicator as such, but it's part of the indicator and it's definitely part of the research.
Thank you, Serge. Do Mary and Sasha have any additional comments, particularly related to the first question, which was more where the governments should focus their efforts?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is very simple, that you go to the community level. I think that's where you build resilience, and one of the rather depressing things that we've seen in this pandemic is failure at 2 levels. One, to connect across borders internationally, but also too much sort of top-down prescriptive measures. Slightly always a function of a crisis, isn't it? But I think this is definitely the point at which governments need to engage much more at the grassroots. They need to listen to what people want, not least because, and we saw this with, for example, the Ebola crisis in West Africa, that actually that turned around. I mentioned before that I thought it was primarily a governance crisis. After a health crisis, it's a governance crisis. And I think what we saw with Ebola in West Africa was, once they started listening to communities, taking seriously what communities already knew how to do in combating the disease there, the response started to change. And of course, that's what builds resilience. If you start at the grassroots, at the community level, you build more effective solutions, because they're more likely to be responses that work, that kind of grip, that work with the fabric of society. So that would be my kind of blanket response in that sense. Just to pick up on part of Daniel's question as well, I think he used the word responsibility. And I think it is a time also, I mean, if we're talking about resilience and how we move through this crisis and how we pick up all the different dimensions that we've heard this afternoon from Serge, from Sasha, and so on. If you're starting to think about how you combat what is such a broad range of threats and potential, you know, problems coming down the track, I think you can really only do that if you start to have a serious conversation about, you know, who is responsible for what. That if you like, there has to be a kind of co-construction of the future. So it's not just about what governments can do and what governments should invest, although that's obviously hugely important. But it's also, say, about what communities want, what kind of capacities they already have and that can be mobilized, sometimes in terms just of knowledge and experience and memory. And it's also the private sector, you know, they need to be unleashed as well. So I think in rethinking, if you like, our social contract for the future, I think that kind of co-responsibility for the crises that we're facing now, but the ones that are coming down the line, particularly climate change, has to be built around a more kind of effective, more productive conversation amongst different actors.
Thank you, Mary. Sasha, would you like to have a go?
Just to absolutely echo what Serge has said around the positive peace indicators, which absolutely need investing in. And I absolutely agree with Mary around local level approaches. We do a lot of work at ISD with communities at a city level around the world, and it is absolutely the only way in which you can genuinely deliver the sort of tailored responses to crises of all forms, but especially to that intercommunal dynamic that gets exploited so often in crises. I agree with that. I'd only add one more thing, which again is sort of back to our issue sets, around the extent to which we see now rising justified grievances, economic fears, exploited by a range of bad actors to divide us and ultimately to undermine trust and faith in liberal democracy, ultimately to push towards more support for authoritarian and indeed nationalist systems of government and governance, to undermine faith in international institutions. There are now concerted forces at play that are investing in shifting social attitudes towards our models of government. We need to be aware of that manipulation. We currently don't have the policies in place to do that. So I would say I would like to see government much more concertedly address this information ecosystem, this information manipulation problem that we see at scale. And that has to be around transparency and oversight of the data mining and usage by the platforms of our data, their advertising approaches, their approaches to content moderation, and to the algorithmic piece of the problem, which is to say how they curate the content on their platforms and how certain forms of messaging, sensationalist and extreme messaging, are disproportionately amplified as a result of their technological architecture. And until liberal democratic governments are able to present a sort of coherent vision for the internet that reflects our values and norms, we are risking to see authoritarian states and these monopolistic tech giants define what is the most important social, cultural, and political space of our time. And the result is, in fact, the distortion of our information ecosystem and what we are experiencing now and will experience more of, which is a disproportionate spread of division and disinformation. So I think that there's low-hanging fruit there, and we must ensure that government works at this alongside investing in the communities that need the help right now.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And I think it speaks directly to one of the questions that I haven't flagged specifically, which was from Leah Pankras, who asked, how do we increase resilience online and offline? So I think many of the points that have been made really answer that question to some extent. And I think, you know, what you have all said about where the government can focus really leads us into the second part of our session, you know, our panel, which is to look at possible options, possible solutions. So I'll ask each one of you to say a few more words how you can bring in some other elements to think about these possible responses. And but before I do that, I just also want to plug out one question which kind of connects again the two parts of the session, which is a question on whether the societal behavior is likely to change from all of this. So, you know, if you can somehow, if you feel like incorporating that into your response as well, please do so. But otherwise, you know, it would be interesting to hear, you know, what other options are out there in responding. And maybe I'll invite Sasha to continue and just to tell us a little bit more what efforts have been already done, because you mentioned this idea of finding a better ways to manage ecosystem. So what is going on? What has been done, and how successful or not has it been so far?
Well, it's been very interesting watching just during this COVID time, the platforms scramble to find responses, and I think there have been great efforts in the first place to surface legitimate content and information. I think that's where efforts have been sincere and well, and you know, and actually quite effective in many contexts. The problem is this, that most governments to date have focused on, you know, one harm at a time in a fairly siloed perspective. So, you know, whether it was child sexual exploitation content or terrorist content online or hate speech, now disinformation and electoral interference, we have a fairly siloed perspective. And by and large, the approach has been to try to deal with the nasty content, take down fakery, take down hate, take down violent images of terrorism. The real challenge is that actually much of the content that is in fact influencing people is a kind of gray area of content, which speaks to the challenge of free speech. It speaks to the challenge of enabling the tech platforms without democratic oversight to make these sorts of decisions around content. What we have said is the focus needs to go beyond content, to looking at essentially the curation of content, the systems, technological systems on these platforms that decide in some sense what you see, what you don't, what is your environment online. We tend to think of it as organic and we tend to think of it as neutral, but of course it isn't organic, and in many ways it's not neutral, which is not to say that it's ideologically biased. It's sort of agnostic to the ideology, but what it does do is that it disproportionately amplifies extreme and sensationalist messaging, something that even Mark Zuckerberg himself has admitted to. The stuff that comes closest to the red line is the stuff that gains the most traction. It's those systems of creation which are inorganically pushing us into these largely polarized environments that are having a massive impact. We're now seeing, you know, 5 years into looking at this in depth, we're really seeing that this is having it is distorting, if you like, the level playing field of speech. It is hard to see moderate voices break through in this context. So what we've said is we must now move towards regulatory frameworks that ensure, you know, robust transparency standards over platform governance. Right now, we don't have access to the data. Third-party review doesn't exist of the data to see how well or badly are they doing in achieving the goals that they've set out. But ultimately, we need to be looking at prioritizing our understanding of the actors, state and non-state, bad actors, understanding those actors and doing something about them, the behaviors, these sort of misrepresentative accounts and networks which are deceptive, and the dissemination mechanisms, as I've said, the sort of algorithmic dissemination of that, so that we're looking at the systems rather than the content itself alone.
Thank you, Sasha. Serge. any reflections on your part? Because what I noted in your presentation, and maybe would be quite interesting to look into, is you said how there is this gap between peaceful and less peaceful countries, and your graph shows this divergence. And what is it that actually has to be monitored carefully in accounting for these divergent pathways, and that can actually lead into some kind of policy responses?
Well, I think, yeah, what I said is, what is really worrying there is the speed at which, the different speed at which you increase and you decrease in peacefulness. So that's the first part. I already spoke about different type of political regimes, decreasing at different speeds also in the levels of peacefulness. And I would just encourage you to identify those authoritarian leaders around the world and look at the position of their countries on the global peace index. I will help you. You can start from the bottom. You will be easier to find them if you would do so. I think, my answer to that question, what should we do, is of course invest in positive peace. And I think the mistake we should not do is, as I said also in my presentation, is invest less in overseas foreign aid and development, because it's just creating more problems. And I know it's very difficult to understand and to accept in times that your own economy and your own people are needing the support, but you have no other choice to do so. And I think that it's also there that positive peace is some kind of innovative form of development. I mean, you can invest in the different pillars of positive peace, create more peace, but at the same time also generate economic, social, governance, and ecological benefits. We see that countries with high levels of positive peace will develop more resilience on all those indicators. We see that 1% increase in positive peace usually equals 3% increase in GDP. It equals lower and more stable inflation rates, better credit ratings, better exchange rates. So those are all effects that are related to an increase in the levels of positive peace, and of course low levels of grievances, less civil unrest. And I mean, it's systemic. That's what one needs to understand. So we are now facing the opportunity or the possibility to make wrong choices and mistakes, and we should not do them. What we also need to understand, especially, it's a very good question about societal behavior. Is this going to change? Well, I think it already changed. When I look at my own countries, at my own country, Belgium, about 15 years ago, far right and the far right party in Flanders was unexisting. They call it Black Sunday because they were really ruled out of parliament. Now it is the #1 party in Flanders, just out of the blue. What happened in the past 10, 15 years? And I think this is clearly linked to new dynamics in our societies. And of course, this is going to have, the pandemic and the crisis is going to have an impact on the global society. I think we will clearly live in a less globalized world after this crisis. I think a lot of countries realize that economic interdependence transforms into economic dependence in type of crisis, and this is definitely going to impact our perception also. We have spoken about magnifying the glasses on inequality. This is definitely going to start processes also. But I think one of the very important things that have been said today by Sasha is the impact of disinformation that is driving, or is developing polarization, that is of course also developing some form of social unrest, of civil unrest. And if not answered, I mean, this is clearly looking at the pyramid of radicalization. If not answered, if those grievances are not answered, they can definitely turn into some form of radicalization and some form of violent extremism at the end of the day. And that's not only religious forms of radicalization. That's not only, I would say, far right, far left, but this is also about, this is, if not answered, this could be Black Lives Matters, or at least the ideas behind the movement can also transform into something more violent if legal ways and democratic ways to achieve their goals, which is a more inclusive and equitable and just society, if this is not answered, at some point this can transform. Same thing for climate change. You know, this investment or these activities for climate change, if not answered, at some point can transform also. So we need to be very, very careful for those powers that are operating online, offline, mostly not overtly, but covertly, and the impact that they could have on our societies and already having today on our societies. So yes, the crisis, the endemic, and the economic recession are going to have an impact on our social behavior. But this has already happened in the past 15 to 20 years. I mean, I spoke about the end of a multilateral approach to international relations and the shift to a more realist, neo-realist. This is also a change. So I think, and you have said it, Vesna, we are at crossroads at the moment. We see evolutions in all forms and shapes, and this is going to have an impact on our society. And we try to track this evolution also. And unfortunately, the negative effects of such evolution with the indexes that we produce at the Institute for Economics and Peace.
Thank you very much, Serge. Mary, do you have any final thoughts on what the human security informed response would look like?
I think we need to be careful about broad brush responses, and that includes overuse of data, because I think what we're seeing is that yes, behavior is already changing, is going to change, but that will be very different. How that my phone keeps going. But how that actually happens, I think will depend very much on where you sit. We already know that people have very different experiences of lockdown, for example. Because of the rising tide of inequalities, people are going to experience the consequences of the pandemic in very different ways. So fault lines are being revealed, and I think we need to be very careful to monitor that one size won't fit all in terms of policy responses and in responding to that changed behavior. I think going against my point in a sense, but one generic outcome is that there is mostly an overwhelming need for change. I mean, my own view is that some of the seeds of this public resentment and civil unrest came out of, amongst other things, the financial crisis and the fact that not enough changed. We had a moment of transformation then. We had a moment of potential real change. And really, you know, not enough did transform. I think it's the New Economics Foundation published a poll the other day, and showing that this was a UK poll, but 92% of people were in favour of real change. Now, you may say that's not terribly surprising, but traditionally people actually are rather conservative and they fear change. So I think that's an incredibly high number. So there has to be action, but I think there has to be action. There has to be policy response, there has to be action by different groups, whether it's business, whether it's civil society or government itself. There has to be action that is, to sort of mirror a word that Sasha used, that's tailored, and that goes back to my kind of community point as well, a sort of bottom-up approach. And I would just say, almost as a footnote, perhaps, because I'm not the expert to some of what Sasha was saying, that I do think that the use of data is critical in all this, the digital dimension that we've been discussing, but that action in the digital space can be both positive as well as negative. I mean, some of the work that we do around peace building is very much sees, you know, digital tools as something that can positively help the situation, that even can address some of those inequalities, can override some of the limitations of access and agency. So I think, you know, what I probably would like to see more of is a creative and a more egalitarian view towards developing strategies for how we use data to respond to this, to tap into what people want and to the changes in behavior and the different positionings and expectations of different groups within society at the same time.
Thank you, Mary. Well, we've come to the end of our conversation today, and I would like to thank our panelists for their contribution and to our audience for engaging in conversation. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you found it interesting and informative. Just to note that a short feedback form will appear in your browser when this event ends, and we'd be grateful if you could take 1 minute to tell us what you thought about the event. And we hope you'll be joining us at another event soon, and please check our website for upcoming events. And I wish you a good day and all the best from LSE IDEAS. Bye.